My name is Scott MALBAURN. I am the director of the Schneider Museum of Art, part of the Oregon Center for the Arts here at SOU. Our special guest today is 2019 John Simon Guggenheim Fellow Daniel Duford, whose exhibition, John Brown's Vision from the Scaffold, Part 2, is on view in our Hyder and Tree Haven galleries now through December 10th. Beyond his recent Guggenheim Fellowship, Duford is also a 2010 Hallie Ford Fellow and a recipient of a 2012 Art Matters grant. His mural and public art can be, his murals, plural, and public art can be found throughout Portland, Oregon. His work has been shown at MASS MoCA, the Atlanta Center for Contemporary Art, Maryhill Museum, Bellevue Arts Museum, the Boise Art Museum, Museum of Contemporary Craft, the Portland Institute of Contemporary Art, also known as PICA, and many more. Residencies include the MacDowell Colony, Crow's Shadow Art Center, and the Ash Street. His work has been reviewed by the New York Times, the Village Voice, New York Press, the Albany Times Union, the Oregonian, Sculpture Magazine, Art Papers, Artweek, the Willamette Week, and the Portland Mercury. He is co-founder of Ground Beneath Us, a place-based institute and artist fellowship in Waterford, Virginia. Published graphic novels include John Brown's Body, The Unfortunates graphic novel, The Naked Boy and the Green Man of Portland. His writing has appeared in High Desert Journal, Parabola, Artweek, ARTnews, the Emily Dickinson Award Anthology, as well as other publications. Speaking of publications, we have this new one hot off the press, highlighting Daniel's exhibition currently up at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at Portland State University. They are available for $20 and get your copy while supplies last here. And you can also order them off of Daniel's website. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Duford. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. Thanks.
And as we get started, we'd love to just check in with our visiting artists during these times. How have you been faring via the pandemic, as well as the current political situation we are in?
What are you talking about? Well, it's interesting you should ask that. So this work I've been working, about John Brown, I've been working on for 3 years now. And so I had always planned to do the two-part show, the one in Portland and then the second down in Ashland. And so the Portland show opened in March and then closed after a week because of the pandemic. And then, when you're working on a subject about abolitionism and the history of race in the country and political violence, all of a sudden this summer it all became very present. And so it kind of changed how I thought, like the work that's down in Ashland I think is different. It really made me, I had to really rethink about what that meant. And so, yeah, it's had a profound effect, all of it. And I think particularly to be in this work, like right now we're waiting to see who's going to be the next president in a presidential race. I think shouldn't have even been close, but then it shouldn't be a surprise if I've spent all my time looking at, the history of Southern power, before the Civil War. And so anyway, yeah, all of this has made the political situation, the pandemic has all made this very, very present, the work that I'm working on. And it also kind of changed, I think, a little bit of some of what I was thinking about with what all that means.
Sure. I made you a co-host, so if you would like to share your screen and share any images with us, you may do so at any time.
Okay. All right. I'm going to show some slides. So there's about 1,000 slides. I have various vacations I've taken over the past. This is. I'm going to go quickly through this early work, and here we go. And so, and talk about some of this early work in relationship to what would be seen on view down in Ashland and the John Brown work. So this is pages from a project that I did called The Naked Boy. I worked on it for many, many years. It was a graphic novel which took an indigenous story of the Bear Mother and it kind of grafted it onto American history. And the way I describe the graphic novel, it's like a dream that the continent is having about America. So all these historic figures become characters in there, like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Walt Whitman. So this is a page from there, but it wasn't just a graphic novel. It became things like installations. So there's an installation view of a show that had sculpture and wall drawings at the Atlanta Center for Contemporary Art. Sorry, it's not going. There we go. So you can see, like, for a long time, the subject matter of John Brown has been there, even though he wasn't there. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But this is Frederick Douglass, who plays a character in The Naked Boy. This is a series of prints I did with my wife, Tracy Schlapp, who's an artist and works in multimedia, but uses the letterpress as a way of creating work that is very democratic and is kind of broadcast out. So we did a project together where we took the historic figures like Frederick Douglass, who are also in the comic, and then did these kind of posters that went around. And then the second part of that story, so I had this like big kind of story that I was working with called Radio Relay Towers, where I was using the structure of a myth, which is, creation story or origin story, the kind of heroic middle, and then the kind of the end. And so the middle part was Sleeping Giant. So it's the story of these two brothers, one who's underground, who you could see. Actually, I'm sharing this. I don't know if you can't see my cursor, but is the underground. He's got the plants growing out of him. On the other side, you have the one-armed superhero. So this is all created during the Bush years. And so, during 9/11 and Homeland Security. And again, looking back at this and thinking about the concerns and thinking about where we are at this moment, the big first question you ask, there's no surprises here. Like, there's just this through line of these things. It's just that we become very, we culturally, we have amnesia often. So this was an installation. Each of those wooden house forms are about 19 inches tall. And this period of work where I begin to combine mythic thinking with historic figures is really becomes how I think this is like really anchors what I do in my practice. So you have these house forms are like pages of a comic. And so in a comic, you have the way a comic works, you have an image and then a space, which is called the gutter, and then another image. And so your brain, when you're reading, fills those in. So I start to think, like, what if the gutter were three-dimensional? So you actually walk through this installation and you're kind of a giant walking through here, and you kind of read the images as you go through, but then these kind of heroic murals of these two figures. And they're really about American power, the one that's underground, and then this one-armed superhero who's been injured and who is in war. So this is a sculpture. So I should say, throughout, from the beginning, I've always worked multimedia. So I work in ceramics, comics, painting, drawing. And so this is a ceramic sculpture of the one-armed superhero, kind of mimicking, it looks like the thinker, but really what he's mimicking is Ugolino and his sons, that famous 19th century French sculpture that comes from Dante's Inferno. But I wanted to have these kind of very fragile monuments that were about power. So as and then I should say the third part of that story is the Green Man of Portland. And I don't have any images here, but if you come down to Portland and you go onto the Green Line in Old Town, there's a installation there that kind of tells the story of the Green Man. So all of these, what I'm learning from all this is ways in which images are the fundamental part of a narrative, and that the narrative is the structure in which these images come from. So if you take the image, it's like the dried and distilled aspect of the narrative. And then when you take it, when you need to tell the story, you kind of hydrate it with the medium of printmaking, sculpture, or what have you. And then the context is what tells the story. So this is a series that I did called the North American Codex, which was thinking about the ways in which the Columbian Exchange, when the Europeans came to the Americas, there was this, what's called the Columbian Exchange, where you have this mingling of cultures and ecosystems and bioforms. And so it's that kind of commingling that this came through. So this is a print called "The Bees Made Honey in the Lion's Head," which is from an old blues song. And then these pots and these prints that were wheat pasted to the wall were kind of telling these stories of fragments from old folk songs and things. And then around then, this is the Ashland connection. In 2013, I did a residency at SOU, and it was the year that The Unfortunates was commissioned, and I got to see it. So Tracy and my wife and our daughter came down, and we went to go see the play. And Tracy was like, this is like your work, on stage. And so she actually, pushed me to go meet the guys, and we became friends with particularly Ramiz Monsef, who's one of the creators. So Ramiz and I, when the play went to ACT in San Francisco a few years later, Ramiz and I co-wrote this graphic novel called the Unfortunates graphic novel. And then around that same time, and I'd also start working on this work at SOU. I did a 15-page woodcut comic, which is also part of the North American Codex, called The Traveler and the Housewife. So each of these woodcut prints are 20 by 30 inches. They're shown in a couple different contexts. One as original prints, which these were shown at the Schneider in 2013, and also as a mass-produced broadside newspaper. And it tells the story of that Columbian Exchange, the mingling of these two, where the traveler in this case was Cabeza de Vaca, the conquistador, and the housewife was the milkmaid from Vermeer's painting. So I also, as I was working through this, I was looking, trying to get ready for this talk today, and I was thinking about these lines of story that go through and the things that because it's now almost a 20-year span that we're talking about. So I was looking at this painting of riots. I start to do images of riots, and change up in the corner of this painting is a crucible, which in alchemy is the symbol of change and cooking things. And so these are riots. This is from 2015. And then I also did a residency at Crow's Shadow Art Center in the Warm Springs Reservation outside of Pendleton. And I worked on this series of prints that had to do with riots. And so I realized that I think as when you're telling stories and when you're involved in the image world of a culture, you begin to pick up signs, even if you don't know what they are, of these kind of conflicts that you see playing out now. So just before we started, I was saying this is a series of really large, but 22 by 22 inch footed ceramic plates that I did with images kind of from this, what I thought of as an American underworld. This is called the Jaguar Man with a border. So it's like this figure that I was working with called the Jaguar Man, and he's being arrested at the border, but there's a flood coming. So all this kind of upheaval. This was 2016 when I had the show, and I gave the gallery talk for this 3 days after the election of Donald Trump. So good times. After the election of Trump, we were trying to think about what kind of images do you make? How do you make images? So, and how do you respond to this? So Tracy and I started to do this series called Resistance is Necessary in the first 100 days. Like basically it was a way of taking all the media images we were looking at and seeing if we can actually not run into them so the way I think of it is like these images that we get through the media, we keep hitting it the way a belly flopper hits the water. So the water surface is just like, it'll just crack your back. But if you actually step back and you use a kind of fermentation through the image making, that you can actually see that those images are skin deep, and you can dive through it, right, and get to the depths to see what's behind it. So we would pick every day. We'd look at the New York Times, which we were getting, daily, and we would look at an image. And so Tracy would either come up with language and then print it, and I'd do a watercolor over it, or vice versa. And so these are a couple of those images from that. But it got hard after a while to concentrate on these fellows' faces for hours every night going to the studio. So we both actually started to work on very different things after this. And for me, what that was that I would start to think about the really going into mythic imagery, and there's a much bigger story, and to basically, again, like I said, get that kind of sense of fermentation and depth that the media was not giving us. So this is from a series that a 10-panel series that was commissioned for Revolution Hall in Portland, and it's 10 panels where it tells the story of revolution in the Americas. But I wanted to go to the very beginning of the Americas before we were talking about the United States, and actually have all these figures who are storytellers, philosophers, poets, be the ones who actually created the revolution, the culture. So these are up permanently in Revolution Hall. So it was also around that year that I was offered by a friend to go down to Waterford, Virginia, to start a artist residency and fellowship called The Ground Beneath Us. And he lives there and he has land, and we were trying to figure out what it is. And it was here that I got caught by John Brown. So I was, you've seen, I've been immersed in this kind of history, but then I went to Harper's Ferry, which is very close, about 20 minutes away from where we were. And I knew, it's funny because I knew about John Brown. I'm reading Thoreau. I'm doing all these things. He's always there, but I just somehow kept missing him. And so I was sort of caught by him. And this is one of the first images I did of John Brown during that residency. And when I came back from the residency, it was 2017, and then Charlottesville happened. So all of a sudden I realized I was in some image world that was very hot and very present. So I started to think about, how am I going to tell this story about John Brown? I didn't want to do a historical biopic kind of approach to things. And so again, taking the ideas I took from the Sleeping Giant projects, from Naked Boy, and really thinking of this in terms of the mythic in order to make it present. So I didn't want to make a historic artifact that said, well, that was then, but I wanted to make it absolutely alive now. So this is the first of these series of watercolor portraits. This is oh my God, I'm totally blanking on his name. Osborne Anderson, who is one of the kind of the right-hand man for John Brown in Harper's Ferry, and to do these portraits of the people around him as if they were my sitters. This is his son, Owen Brown. And in the window behind them, there's something else happening. In this case, it's a painting that has to do with Isaac and his son from the biblical story. This one that's, Washington crossing the Delaware, based on the famous painting, and really create this tension between the sitter who's in the room with me and this other thing happening outside the window. And so when I went to MacDowell, where I really started to think about it, this was the first image that this is the title image, John Brown's vision on the scaffold. So here he is at the scaffold, but what the vision is he's seeing is this great tree, the kind of tree of the world. In the background, you see Robert E. Lee, who arrested him when he was with the Union Army, and then obviously became a hero of the Confederacy. And then in the front, you see Joseph Cinque, who was the leader of a rebellion on the Amistad, and Nat Turner, both of whom were huge influences and inspirations for John Brown, where he saw that African Americans could actually defend themselves. So the thing with John Brown is this is the general and supermax. So I guess I should just very quickly say, if you don't know the story of John Brown was a radical abolitionist who, unlike some of the other abolitionists who had been working for many decades, in the antebellum America, he was not a pacifist. He thought that the only way that you were going to purge slavery from the United States was through blood, through violence. And he was an absolute failure as a businessman. He had all these business failures, but he was laser focused on abolition. So he was respected by and friends with Harriet Tubman. In this painting that you see, they're helping a contemporary man escape from a supermax prison. Here he is, he had met with Thoreau at some point and really changed Thoreau's mind. Before he was hung, Thoreau wrote a very famous piece called A Plea for Captain John Brown. Here they are at the stump of the world tree. So this is as if like the life of the culture, the tree of life has been clear cut. This actually isn't in the show. I just wanted to include, this is a series of 5 that were down at the Orange County Museum of Art, or were done at the same time. There's very famously, John Brown and Frederick Douglass, who are friends, had met in a quarry in Pennsylvania just before John Brown's raid of Harper's Ferry. And what they were discussing was that John Brown wanted Frederick Douglass to join him in what he said hive the bees, which is to bring all the enslaved people to him, and that they'd break into the armory at Harper's Ferry, steal the weapons, hand them out to people as they're freeing them, and then disappear into the woods of the Appalachians, and then kind of like wage this guerrilla war. So this is actually not in either of the shows that we see, but this is part of that same series. And these are large, all of these are 36 by 45 inches watercolor on paper. So another piece kind of, which became a really important piece for me, this is Abolitionists in a Flood. This is when this kind of image just came to me, where they were all sitting together, kind of posing on a couch for me. Like they're my sitters. So you have, in this painting, you have John Brown. It's all anachronistic too. They're all at different ages where they wouldn't be together. So John Brown with his pike. So one of the things he did during he had paid for hundreds of these pikes, which were just blades on the end of a stick, because he knew that he couldn't get enough guns. The idea was that it was a really simple, tool that you could use to just hand out to defend yourself. And then there's Sojourner Truth in the back, Emily Dickinson holding a sword, Thoreau, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and then you have in the yellow coat is the editor and the publisher of The Liberator, and oh my God, totally. It's funny because I've been thinking about him for so long. In the middle is one of the Secret Six, who was helped finance the raid. He was a rich abolitionist from the North. So he's holding this chalice, which is overflowing with water, and the flood waters are coming upon them as they sit there. And in the far background is the Fisher King from Arthurian legends. And the idea of the Fisher King is he's a wounded king, and his wound means that the land is wounded. So it's like if the sovereign is sick, the culture is sick, the land is sick. So I start to do this group of portraits, and what I wanted to do in this project was not really think about so much about John Brown as a singular heroic figure, but think about all the people around him. Because he sacrificed his family. You know, he actually brought his family along. A number of his sons died in Kansas, where they did a number of raids and they were politically active, and then in Harper's Ferry. So here you have all the sons that went with him, plus his son Oliver, who's in the yellow jacket, his wife, and behind them is his daughter Annie. And they had a little farmhouse in Maryland, which was about 20 miles down the road from Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And that's where they hid out with all the men getting ready to do the raid. So the two women would kind of act as buffers to the nosy neighbors. But in the background is Owen, his son, who's holding a slaughtered lamb. And Owen was one of the few people who actually got away. Most of the men were either killed or tried and hung. Owen got away. And in the background, you see the kind of Kansas prairie, the cyclone happening. And then this is these are the 5 African-American men who accompanied him. So this is called co-conspirators, the Amistad. In the window outside, from them, you see there's a line of riot cops holding the beach against the Amistad. So there's this, again, a kind of direct connection to the protest and to the kind of the life of these issues of racism, systemic racism, and slavery. So I also wanted to make sure, again, thinking about the wider community around John Brown. This is a triptych called Abolitionist Wives. So you have Eliza Garrison, who is William Lloyd Garrison's, who actually he was the one in the yellow coat, William Lloyd Garrison's wife, in the green. In the middle you have Anna Douglas, who's Frederick Douglass's wife, and Mary Brown, who is John Brown's wife. So these women were all they were all abolitionists in their own right. They're all essential to the work that their famous husbands, their iconic husbands, did. So in this series, in the background, I wanted to include a reference to a myth or a story in which a woman is endangered, goes into the woods, and finds her own power in the woods. So Mary Brown in the background is the Handless Maiden, which is a story about a young girl who's basically sold out by her dad and cuts her hands off so he can ensure his riches. And she goes, and eventually, it's a long story, but eventually she grows her own hands back. In the middle, Anna Douglas, and that's the Bear Mother, which is, I referenced it in the beginning with the Naked Boy. So that is this foundational myth of the Americas, where a woman goes and ends up marrying a handsome man who turns out to be a bear and gives birth to twins who are cubs. And then in the spring, when her brothers come to get her, they take the twins back, who become emissaries between the bear world and the human world. And she often, there's different versions, but she often becomes the shaman in her own right. And then in the Eliza Garrison, that's a story called The Three Spindles, in which a young woman who's pregnant out of wedlock goes into the woods and is kind of saved by the fairy folk. And so here's some details of those. And then I did a series of still lifes to go with this, in telling the story of John Brown. So one of the things that runs through this work, when I talk about not just focusing on a pinpoint in history, because when I was in the South, when I was in Virginia, and anyone here who's been to the South or lived in the South, there's a kind of obsession with the Civil War and this moment in history, but it is like a pinpoint, and there's a bigger continuum and there's a bigger context. So I start to do these still lifes with the idea that they're not unlike the windows. There's something happening in the foreground, this kind of dailiness, this life, this kind of very, rote thing about the food and the things you're eating. And I really thought about it because John Brown was always, he was always very poor throughout his life. And there's been a number of times where like when Frederick Douglass first met him, talked about how welcoming but also spare his table was. So this is this table, but in the background there's some sort of climate disaster kind of, again, edging in, like the flood of the abolitionists kind of edging in on them. So here's John Brown's head on a platter, and with sunflowers growing out of it. And this is called Still Life with Bread and Flood. You see the flood coming from this, and this is a plantation house. This is Still Life with Scaffolds and Forest Fire. So when John Brown was caught during this Harper's Ferry raid, he was injured, and so they had him on a cot, which is how they tried him during the trial. And he would get so mad he would stand up because his lawyer kept trying to use a defense that he was insane. But John Brown was like, I'm not insane. The slavery is a sin against humanity and against God. And you're the ones, you, the Southern, like the Virginia people, you're the ones who are guilty of this great sin. So here he is in the background of this very rich still life. And just one other thing I think about still lifes is the tradition comes about really, like if you look at Dutch still lifes or still lifes from that moment in history, is also when the riches from the Americas, the extraction from slavery, from suppression of indigenous peoples, that's the wealth of Europe that's being shown on these tables. So in the series, you have the portraits, but there is also something called the tree time divinations from the scaffold. So it's like, these are like little moments in time that tell the story of a tree, the life of the tree, in its relationship to the scaffold. So it goes from like the beehive and the wild beehive in the tree to a traditional Iroquois longhouse, bark longhouse, to the mast of the tall ships, to the railroads, all the way to the scaffold, which he's standing on. Oh, and I guess one thing I buried the lead. Here's one of the details of the pine, the tall pines. Is that the impetus for this show, when I talk about this idea of like a spread of time, the vision on the scaffold that I'm referring to is this idea that, so when he was hung, he went to the scaffold kind of standing straight. He said his piece. He was incredibly eloquent. He really shifted the country, particularly the North, to his way of thinking about abolition. And they were about to hang him, and they put the hood over his head, and they put the noose on him. But then they had to wait while all the soldiers lined up. So I'm imagining that 10 minutes standing there with the hood on his head, the vision of what he's involved in, going like forward and future, back, and encompassing all these different things. So this is a painting that's at the JSMA called Towards the Gallows, the Empire Makes Its Way. So it's a riff on a Thomas Cole painting. Thomas Cole, if you don't know, was one of the foremost 19th century American landscape painters. The title is a riff on a painting in the St. Louis State House called Westward, the Course of Empire Makes Its Way. And that's this triumphal painting of moving across the Great Divide, and it has Tecumseh and Jefferson and all that, Manifest Destiny. So in this case, it's just John Brown sitting on his coffin coming towards the scaffold, and there hangs his broadsword. So for the show in Ashland, for the second part, I'd had a different plan. And as I mentioned, I was the beginning of this, the things changed all of a sudden over the summer. And I had to really start to think about this subject matter that I'm deeply invested in. So this is one of the first oil paintings I did of John Brown, where he's sitting holding his pike, but it was never finished. I was never satisfied. So I finished it for this one. And in the background in the window is a burnt forest. So by the time I'm doing this, especially those of you down in Ashland, we, here in my studio in Portland is in the industrial part, and I look over the hills of Forest Park, and the smoke even here was, it was unbearable. So I can't imagine what it was like down in Ashland. So there's a honey, there's a beehive. This one's called Honey for a Burnt Forest. And then I also wanted to think about, so originally I was going to do contemporary abolitionists. And during the summer, I've been really reading and watching and paying attention to all these contemporary people working in abolition who were part of the uprisings, the protests, after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murders. And I started to think about them, but I thought, those are not my images to make. I don't think they're mine to do. And I also felt like anyone who's a living person, I need to talk to them. I need to actually, if I'm going to do a portrait, I should actually do a portrait of them one-on-one and not just take their image, for the purposes of this. So what I decided instead was to think, what's the generation in between? So you have John Brown and all of his cohorts in the first part. So I started to think of all the African-American artists who used John Brown as an aperture to think about something else, or to make work about John Brown. So this is Jacob Lawrence, and he did a beautiful series on John Brown. And I did one of, and I don't have, I'm going through this quickly so we can get to the end, but in the show there's also, there's an image of W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote a wonderful biography of John Brown, who was also part of the Storer College, which is in Harper's Ferry. So there's like a direct connection from Frederick Douglass to W.E.B. Du Bois, and you just see that connection. I did Odetta, even though she didn't actually sing songs directly about John Brown. She was this important voice for the protest movement in the 60s. And then I did one, I was trying to, oh my God, sorry. So I also did one of young John Brown, or younger John Brown, where he is holding his pike. So part of this too, the other part I did with this is to do the vision of John Brown. So this is actually a poem with images. So when you go to the gallery, you'll see there are like kind of hand-drawn words, and then these. So this is the smashing of the scaffold. So there's a narrative throughway with these. These are watercolors. That it's that first vision that I'm imagining he has when he's on the scaffold, where he is standing there, and suddenly everything kind of opens up, and it goes into the landscape. And we're thinking, in this case, I'm beginning to think about abolition, not just in a historic sense, but in this much bigger ecological, cultural sense. So this is a flood coming and smashing the scaffold. You follow this. You follow the beam and the noose as it flows down the river. Here it's hooked onto a flaming slave ship, and there's the blue heron that follows him all the way down the river. And then there comes to where you have fires. At some point, the shackles are being melted down to create the pikes, and then there's the burning of the cotton fields. And then you go all the way to the kind of renewal of the fields as growing indigenous food crops, and then finally the nest of the heron, where there's a kind of a rewilding or renewing of the landscape. So again, it's like thinking of the abolition in a much bigger way. So I think this is the last image I have. So this is the painting I think that really sums up. This came, this is the last painting I made for the show. And this is one of those things where it really took all summer to kind of ferment in my sketchbook and in my, to think about what this thing is going to be. Originally, this was going to be a triptych, and it was going to do some other things. Are going to be separate images. This is called Migrations. The Grieving Woman Knows Your Real Name. So this is taking an episode from Parsifal. Again, this is going back to those kind of Arthurian stories. And in Parsifal, who eventually finds the Grail and restores the Grail Kingdom, comes upon his cousin who's holding the dead, her husband, who has died in the wars fighting for his father, for Parsifal's father. At this point, Parsifal doesn't really know who he is because he's been raised in the woods. And she says, like, I know who you are, you're Parsifal. So it's this idea that the woman who's grieving is the one who could see through all your stuff and know who you really are. And so I kept doing this drawing, and it really was like closer to something that looked like Parsifal. But, and being in Portland and having gone to a number of the protests, this is the imagery that came up. And then, of course, this is also happening while it's been burning in Oregon. And so this idea of the fire and this afterlife. And so this is such a fresh painting for me, but I'm thinking, in the front, there's a skull with a coin in its mouth. That's kind of like in the river Styx. This is kind of like the underworld, the afterlife, all coming and converging on this one spot with the forest fires and John Brown crossing the river holding a baby. So I think that was it. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I have. So I'm happy to take any questions. So again, this is, there's a lot of richness in thinking about what John Brown really means to the culture as an image, as a figure in history, and I was just having all these other things kind of filter through that and come into me as I made the images. So I guess I'll take some questions now.
Thank you, Daniel, so much. So for our audiences, feel free to unmute yourself, and you can ask your questions directly to Daniel. Or if you want to type it into the chat, I could read that aloud for everyone. And just to get things started here, Daniel, so I think it's good to point out that this work that we have on view here was pretty much made in the past 6 months.
Yeah.
Which is an incredible amount of work to do in a 6-month period. You are a partner, a father, an educator. Can you talk a little bit about that balance of making work and being as involved as you are?
Yeah, I mean, it's not always easy. It's because as I said, my wife, who's here, is an artist as well, and has been involved in a really, really rich project for the past 3 years, and which also got halted because of coronavirus. Working with incarcerated adults throughout the state, and so that's like a lot of heaviness in the house. We have a 13-year-old who's actually here with me right now. In the studio, quietly, not listening to me. But so I think what we were very lucky as a family, because I have a studio that I rent. We have a studio at our house where Tracy goes, and then the house would just give over to our daughter. So there was some space during the day where we can actually get away from each other and then come back and talk about like what we were doing, so that was good for us to have that. But it was pretty intense. Like I was really stuck this summer working on this because I was so aware of the nature of the images I'd make given this subject matter. Like I was really, really aware of that, like thinking like I'm not allowed to do certain images, you know? And in fact, actually, even before that, when I was working on the portraits, I kind of made a decision where, you know, like there's the image of the scaffold. That's a really loaded, image, particularly for a white man to be doing. You know, he was hung. So when I included the sword in there, I wanted some other thing in there that wasn't just about the finality of this thing. And so this summer, you know, like I was trying to think of like, how do I actually show a kind of joy and creativity and something else within this really hard subject matter? So yeah, it's a lot to be always thinking about these things. As you can imagine, it could be a pretty heavy household. You know, we're like prison, abolition. You know, so we watched a lot of Schitt's Creek. Schitt's Creek and A Good Place.
I was wondering about what are you doing? I mean, about white supremacy. Now, those are images that you certainly could treat without, you know, violating anybody's sense of ownership.
Right. Well, I didn't really show it as much because I wanted to, and there's a lot that I was trying to get through today, but things like the naked boy was, in a sense, like one of the driving characters in that narrative was the kind of military industrial white supremacy complex that was part of that. And so, I mean, part of it too was when I showed when we were doing those Resistances Necessary, like, you know, sitting there and because if you're, any of you who are artists, you're drawing, you're spending like hours like meditating on, you know, a person's face. Like if I'm doing that kind of portraiture, it really comes to a point where there's like kind of like poisoning that happens. So that's one of the like when I was working on the portraits of, say, you know, any of the abolitionists, those group portraits, I felt like I was actually talking to those people. And so in terms of white supremacy, I mean, it's certainly there, but I also feel like, I don't know, like there's a kind of poison that comes in from that as well. But I do, like today, I have to say, I'm very, you know, I'm hoping that tonight we have a really good news about the president, but the fact that it's close, the fact that that's just, that, and having spent all this time thinking about this long history of abolition, you just think, maybe there's nothing we can do about it. You know, I mean, like maybe it's just baked into the culture. So yeah. Anyway, but yeah, there are images from the past that I was doing about that, but there was a kind of, I just was like diving into that muck. It takes a lot out of you.
Yeah. Well, it does seem to be baked in. It's baked into our history. I mean, it's just everywhere. And that's what's blown my mind in the past 6 months or whatever. I've just been, you know, from stuff online and a Black friend who's sending me things, and just generally Black voices are much more loud and around, and I have access to them, which, you know, in my white supremacist situation, I don't get access that often.
Right.
And so it's been quite an education, really.
Yeah. I think when I think about like image making, and this is what like this past 3 years is, you know, there are artists who I just really adore, and you could probably see their influence in my work, like Leon Golub and Francisco Goya and Suko, really political artists. Yes. And I love their work.
Yeah.
And they're doing really important work. But I also think that I guess like there's a kind of alchemical aspect to some of these images where it's like, I don't want to just actually call it out. I actually want to transform it somehow through
Absolutely.
the image.
Yeah, very
like,
important. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
Daniel, you mentioned you know, things being very timely. early on, you mentioned that you were, not that aware of John Brown.
Hmm.
Today, in our circle, beyond your exhibition, I'm hearing that OSF might be working on or workshopping a John Brown play for the future. And then also Showtime, the television channel, has a new John Brown series, which is head up by the actor Ethan Hawke. Um, you know, how does it feel as an artist to know about and be aware, of something that you've recently discovered and begin investigating? Now it's becoming more into the populace of our world.
Well, I'm in the act of suing Ethan Hawke and James McBride for copying me. So and I'll talk to OSF as well, because I think it was my idea first. No, I think it's, again, I think it's that thing where, like I was saying, where if you're an image maker or a writer or anything where you're just kind of involved in the image world, I think you come upon these things independently. I don't think it's an accident that all of a sudden John Brown is starting to be on people's mind, given what we've just been through. We're not just been, we're still in. I was watching in my research, I would go back and I would watch some things like PBS had a American Heritage thing about John Brown, but it was the late 90s. And it was really close to Ken Burns's Civil War series. And there was a very particular spin on John Brown at that point, which I think was close to the political feelings of the time, which was a kind of apologia for conservatism. There was a kind of like there was a writing off of John Brown at that moment, and I read a really wonderful book that was called John Brown Still Lives, where it looks at all of these different points from 1859 when he was killed to now, of different artists and writers who took on John Brown and what spin they put on it, and so in the 20s there was all these Southern writers like Robert Penn Warren, who wrote an absolutely a biography that made him seem like a complete madman, killer, cheater, and that became the prevailing idea, which was also part of the New South, the lost cause narrative, which we like literally still have right now. We just watched it play out on Tuesday, so you could see that there's people who then try to rescue him. So James McBride's take on it, which if you haven't read The Good Lord Bird, it's one of my favorite books. It's absolutely fantastic. And, and he plays with it. Like, he pokes fun at some sacred figures like Frederick Douglass. He doesn't let John Brown off the hook, but he makes him this really full figure. So yeah, I think there are these moments where like just a whole bunch of people see that, and I think Ethan Hawke and I are the same age. So there might also be something there where like there's something where there's similar influences that you find yourself coming there. So although, again, I think mine's better than his. No, actually, if you watch the Showtime, it's really wonderful. I love the show. So.
Thank you. From the chat, we have a question, comment from Ezra. You've touched on this a little bit, but I'm interested in hearing more about how you navigate the complicated relationship between wanting to produce images that are culturally relevant while also navigating allyship and sensitivity.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not simple, and I don't think any kind of art form or image making should be clean or straightforward, But that being said, okay, here, well, let me give you an example. So this summer in Portland, there are all these amazing murals that just came up all over downtown. And you could see it in the few blocks where where there were all the protests were happening nightly, and there were these just really wonderful expressions, these really powerful images. And there's a part of me that thought I should go do that. But I also, again, I thought it's not for me to do. And also those are the images that are really, those are the images that are important right now. They come out of the heat and the ferment of right now, but they're not the images that come from that kind of, what I would say, the fermentation of that kind of like taking things down into you and letting them, letting all the microbes kind of, you know, break it down and then, and make it into something else. And that's what I wanted to do with this. It's easy for me to occasionally do something where I'm just responding. And actually I'd say like, that's what the Resistance is Necessary series is. It's like, we're taking an image that you've seen that day in the New York Times. And then we're trying to apply some language that does something else to the image, where it takes it out of that, like, it's the image hitting you right now. So the idea of allyship, I think part of that is to be respectful enough to digest it, is to not, and again, that's why this summer I didn't want to just say, here are some like really fantastic contemporary right now abolitionists who are doing some really amazing things. I'm going to do paintings of them. Again, unless I talked to them, unless I knew them. I know. So for me to think about, I've been thinking about Jacob Lawrence. I feel like I have a relationship with his work. I have a relationship with, you know, W.E.B. Du Bois from reading his work. So I felt like that's like, again, it's that kind of digestion that you do. So I think what happens with the allyship question is that it is a kind of knee-jerk grabbing at a thing and then taking it, as opposed to just saying, I just need to wait a moment. Kind of like what we're doing right now. We're just waiting a moment before we actually have the new president. We're fermenting at the moment.
Thanks, Daniel. There's another comment in the chat, which I will read, and I will have a little bit of a response to that, and then we'll get a response from you, from Alan Hicks. There's a lot of material here to digest, wondering how a docent discussion might best proceed within that context of a limited presentation. You know, and I just wanted to follow up on that a little bit from my perspective of being, you know, part of the museum institution, in which with our docents, you know, we always ask our docents to take audiences through the exhibitions and share, you know, some of their highlights and favorite parts, and utilize the language coming directly from the artist. But, you know, we don't have to share 100% of the story. You know, there's a lot sort of like left open and laid out for certain givens to happen for people to bring. Any thoughts from you, Daniel, in regards to docents discussing your work?
Yeah, I know it's an issue, like with the work. There's like all these things going on, and I think one way of doing it is just to trust the viewer. So if the docent has enough of that spine, the skeleton of what is going on. So it's like, this emerges out of thinking about that vision, because what's down in Ashland really is that, like, it's even more about the vision than the one in the JSMA, where it's like there literally is this like idea of what's happening under that hood at that moment, is, you know, going into the afterlife, and its relationship to now. So if you could kind of communicate a little bit of that, and just point out some of the things to look at. So the idea of the pike that he carries as a staff, the use of portraiture in which there's an outside and inside, like, and then let the viewers actually have their own relationship. Like that last painting I showed you is so fresh for me. I've been working on it all summer trying to, and it really coalesced. You know, as I said, it was going to be a series, then I was going to start to put it together. like, I don't even know, like just now, like talking about it, I was like, oh yeah, I'm thinking about this in a certain way. So I want to have actually I want to let the audience have those clues from the docent that these are things to look for. This gives you hopefully a bearing, but now you can wander through the paintings.
We have time for about one more question. Anybody has any questions or comments? If not, if you have any follow-up questions,
Looks like Pat has one.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance of letting yourself go into the pain and the angst of something that you're trying to portray. I remember when I did some acting, that was always an issue as well. You just get immersed into some place. And I trust that what you got for a little balance was your family ties.
Mm-hmm.
You guys could do that for each other. Living down in Ashland, I just want to let you that the fire has been very traumatic. We've had lots of people that were affected by it that we've been working on. But the balance for me has been to notice the generosity that has come forward. And it would be too soon to put in this exhibit any of the current abolition work. We have 400 years of healing from slavery forward. Yeah. So I found your exhibit just really profound. It was interesting for me that the room of 15 pieces with that gave me the clue to go back in the first room and understand that better. I'm not sure if you would want to switch that, but that was how I could understand why there was a heron and a coyote and stuff in an earlier piece. And the portraits were very meaningful. I'm a singer, and Odetta's one of my loves. Thank you. And I looked up some of the other people. I think maybe as a docent, it might be nice to say a little bit about who they are and what their value is. I was glad I had a little phone thing to look them up and see who are these guys he just put here. So thank you for those.
Yeah, actually, that's a great suggestion. There are, like, in the portraits specifically, you can actually say, like, this is who Jacob Lawrence is. Like, you can kind of say who they are so that people, like, not everyone's going to know all of those people and to have a sense of who they are.
Yeah.
But thank you. I really, this watercolors I always thought of in that room. So, so that was like the idea. But I'm glad to hear that you went back and forth between the two.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat. And
I'll put the vote in too for letting people absorb it. Although I went with someone who wasn't as good at picking up on the connections, and maybe a docent can help point out how things are connected to give people a path that don't work that well in imagery. Yeah.
Thank you, Pat. Just to mention that we do have Tuesday docent-led tours at 12:30, in which anybody can sign up for on our museum's website, visit and click, and we limit that to 9 people. So to keep the docent in the group at a cap of 10 for safety reasons. But every Tuesday at 12:30, and come more than once if you wish. So you can share that information, and within our docent notes, we do have the information of the individuals who are in Daniel's portraits. Everybody, we are out of time. I would like to thank Daniel so much for his hard work in the past 6 months to create these powerful images for us to share with our audiences. And I would like to also thank his partner, Tracy, for doing good work as well and supporting her partner in his endeavors. Thank you for everybody joining us on this talk. It will be edited and put up on our website soon, in which you can share with others who were unable to join us today. Daniel, any last words?
No, I just really, I so appreciate the fact that you're even doing the show, given all that you've been through this year, not just COVID, but the fires and everything else. So it really is pretty wonderful to have the show. And thank you all for coming as well.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.